Okay guys, so this video is about how the scientific principles apply to hypertrophy. So what are the scientific principles? Well, I have attended several seminars by Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization and read his book, The Scientific Principles of Training, which he co-authored with Chad Wesley-Smith, perhaps one other author. Apologies if I've forgotten anyone. But anyway, great book, really, really informative, but it largely focuses more on sort of powerlifting and strength athletes. Now, in one of the talks I saw Mike give 2 years ago, he talks about how this applied to hypertrophy, and it got me thinking. And I've thought more on this, and that's what this video is going to be all about. But essentially, we're going to look at specificity, overload, fatigue management, variation, stimulus recovery, adaptation curves, phase potentiation, and individual differences. And how they apply to hypertrophy. Now, there's a reason I read those in that order. That's from the most important to the least important. So you want to focus most on the specificity end of the spectrum rather than getting too much caught up in individual differences stuff. But now I'll go into a little bit of detail about how these apply to hypertrophy specifically. If just building some muscle as your goal, then this is a good place to be. So number one is specificity. That basically means that your training should all be geared towards causing the adaptation that you desire. So, in the powerlifting book, they were talking about improving your performance on the competitive lifts for a 1 rep max. In this case, the adaptation you want is more muscle mass. So you you want to train specifically for that. So what are some guidelines for that? Well, Matthias Wernborn did a study looking at frequency, intensity, volume, and these factors and how they affect hypertrophy, and came up with some guidelines which are phenomenal. So if I talk you through those, and also some general principles from other literature. So looking at a broader spectrum before we get into Wernborn's specifics, in terms of intensity, that's percentage of 1 rep max. You should be lifting more weights heavier than 60 to 65% of your 1 rep max most of the time. In terms of training volume, more is better. Essentially, there is a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy until you cannot recover from it, and then it does more harm than good. Frequency, you want to train a muscle group 2 to 3 times a week. And training to failure is not required, but can be done occasionally and will probably enhance results if it is done occasionally. In terms of rest periods, you should avoid taking rest that are so short that it compromises performance on subsequent sets. So, usually on compound lifts, 2 to 3 minutes, and on smaller movements, about 90 seconds to 2 minutes is a good rule of thumb. Range of motion, you should be generally using a full range of motion. That should be your default setting. Partial lifts do have their place, but the vast majority of your work should be done over full ranges. And as far as rep speed and tempo goes, they don't have much impact on hypertrophy, but they're a small factor, and there are times when you might want to emphasize a slightly slower lowering phase, or you might want to hold in a contracted position. So those are some general guidelines for training specifically for hypertrophy, and those are backed by science. And then getting into Wernborn's exact or more exact numbers to apply to your training. Essentially, per session, you should do 40 to 70 reps per muscle group, and that is for a total of 80 to 210 reps per muscle group per week. So if you train 2 or 3 times a week, that's your range, 80 to 210 reps over the course of a week per muscle group. As I said, load should be above 60 or 65% 1RM most of the time, and about 2/3 to 3/4 of your work should be done in the 6 to 12 rep range. You can train a little bit heavier than that and a little bit lighter, but most of your work should be in that range. And you should train each muscle group 2 to 3 times a week, looking to gradually increase volume over time. So that's a pretty good approach in terms of base your training around those core principles, and you're off to a great start of training specifically to hypertrophy. So after we've done specificity, we move on to overload. That's the next most important factor. So overload, progressive overload, is essentially you need to train hard enough to disrupt homeostasis to cause adaptation to occur. And it needs to be progressive in manner, because if you just keep doing the same training over and over again, It's no longer an overload to the body. It doesn't force the body to adapt. So essentially, your training has to, on average, get harder over time. You should be training hard now, and you should be training harder in future. So how can you manipulate some variables within training to make this happen? So first up, make sure you're at least training at 60% 1RM to cause you to be lifting enough weight to cause adaptation. Then increase your volume across the course of a training phase up to the most you can recover from. So you really push the limits there. So that means at the start of a mesocycle, you might be at your minimum effective dose, and then you gradually increase that over the weeks and months until you hit what Mike Israetel called your max recoverable volume, and then you no longer can recover, and you have to back off, deload, and then start the process over. It's worth remembering that essentially the more training you can do and recover from, the better your results. So you want to push towards that upper limit, really push the envelope there. Now, another way you can do that is increasing your proximity to failure across the course of a phase of training. So you might start out on week 1 where you leave 3 or 4 reps in reserve, but by the end of the training phase, everything's to 1 rep from failure, or even pushing to failure or getting a couple of forced reps in. Potentially you might use that as a technique, but across the course of the training, you get closer and closer to that point of failure, and that allows you to overload week on week. Obviously, we should be progressive, so you should be looking to use more weight or do more reps with a given weight, or more sets week on week to increase overload. So by doing so, you can increase in intensity by improving or increasing the amount of weight you can lift, but you also can overload via volume by just doing more sets. And then, I suppose you can overload by using advanced techniques. I said you might even do force reps, you might do drop sets, supersets, giant sets, all these kind of things, rest pause. You might use those, and in general, you would use those, to provide a stimulus that you haven't already been using. So, at the start of your training phase, you don't need to use these, but towards the end, to milk the gains for that little bit more before you hit that ceiling of your ability to recover, you throw these techniques in. So then the third factor is fatigue management. So most important by miles with your fatigue management is your sleep and nutrition. Sleep is your number 1 for recovery, closely followed by nutrition, and then everything else is way below. Get these 2 right. So you should be training to sleep for 8 hours a night and eating appropriately to your goals. So if you're trying to build muscle, you need to be in a caloric surplus, hitting your protein requirements for the day, making sure you're getting plenty of carbohydrates to fuel your training, and sufficient fats to make sure your hormones are optimal. Now, I have a video talking about optimizing your nutrition, so that might be worth looking into if you need a bit more advice on nutrition. Now, I was just talking about starting in your minimum effective dose and then gradually progressing up to your MRV and then deloading. That's actually kind of factoring in fatigue management, because across the phase of the training, you're not always just hammering it, you're gradually increasing. So, your fatigue's not accumulating that much at the start, and by the end is really high, and then you take a deload. And a deload is one method for fatigue management. So it might be every sort of 7-8 weeks, you need to take 1 week off, or a very light week to wash away some of the fatigue you've accumulated, and refresh yourself to go again hard in the next phase of training. Another thing when you think about fatigue management, a more practical detail with your programming, is thinking about the overlap between exercises. So if you're training your back squats and then for your quads, but then another day you're doing deadlifts to hit your hamstrings, and then you're doing bent over rows for your back, by day 3 there, your lower back is absolutely fried, and it has had a big stimulus day on day, and your performance will then drop off because it's just that muscle group's not recovering. So you have to think about the overlap between exercises and how you sequence them through the week. And then from phase of training to one to the next, you should vary the form of overload, so you're not constantly battering away on the same pathway. So it might be that your rep range shifts slightly, so you might have been doing mostly 6 to 8 reps in one phase and then 10 to 12s in the next. Or you vary the exercise slightly, so you shift from a front squat to a back squat. or a bench press to an incline bench press, for example. So you're hitting slightly different fibres, a slightly different movement pattern, reducing the risk of wear and tear injuries over repetitive movement patterns. You might also vary the strength curve, for example. So moving from free weight exercises to cable machines, which have a more constant sort of tension throughout the movement. Or using things like bands and chains for accommodating resistance. All of these things could be played around with just to vary the overload and the stimulus, meaning that you're not constantly fatiguing exactly the same fibres in exactly the same way. Now, as a bigger overview, looking at like the training year, an active rest phase is one kind of fatigue management. Think of a sport, they have an off season, then a pre-season before they go. For example, in football, they maybe have a month to 6 weeks when they're not playing on at all, and they active rest. These guys don't just sit on the sofa all day, every day doing nothing. They probably stay pretty active. They're doing some gym work, but they're doing something different to their sport. Now, if you're always in the gym lifting 52 weeks of the year, I wouldn't suggest that's optimal. You won't lose muscle if you take a week or two of a time off. In fact, you'll probably resensitize your body to the benefits of training and refresh yourself so you can train harder, and your results will be better. So maybe for a natural time to take some off, say at Christmas, for example, take a week or 2 weeks off around the Christmas period, have fun seeing family and friends, and it'll set you up for a great start to the new year when you get back to training. Or if you go away on holiday for 2 weeks. I've done it in the past. I've stressed about, is there a gym where I'm going? Maybe not such a big deal, just chill, have a great 2 weeks, and when you get back to the gym after your holiday, you will be itching to get in there and smash it. Slightly different to an active rest phase is a maintenance phase, and these are really important for building muscle. It's an odd one because no one really wants maintenance, but it's something you need to do. For one reason, at the end of a bulking phase, it's a great idea to sort of hold on to the muscle before you go into a cut so you don't immediately lose it. I've done a video on that. It's a big mistake people make. I've written a couple of articles as well. I'll link those below for you where I talk about maintenance. But these are phases where volume is reduced greatly, and you're just training to maintain your size and maybe increase strength a little bit, but the overload on the body through volume is much lower, and it allows your body systemically to have a period of recovery before pushing for the next hard phase of training. So the fourth factor is variation. So how I see this applying to hypertrophy and building size is how you vary exercises. So with a powerlifter, it's maybe they start with variations of the core lifts and get more and more specific as they come closer to competition. For example, transitioning from dumbbell bench to incline bench to close grip bench to competition bench, something like that. Well, how I see this applies to building muscle is we want what's called directed variation. So you do vary your exercises to provide a novel stimulus to keep the body progressing, but it's not like this muscle confusion or keep the body guessing that you hear about as such. It's planned, it's strategic, and it has a goal. So again, you sequence from lifts that target a muscle group in a logical fashion, or hit different regions of that muscle. So, for example, you might have a phase where you're focusing on the clavicular head, that's the upper portion of the chest, and the next phase you hit the sternal head or the lower chest. So you might transition from predominantly incline pressing variations to doing flat or decline or even dips, for example, to target the lower fibres of the chest. But rather than just being like a willy-nilly throw exercises in and out, there should be some structure to that, and it should be directed about the adaptation you're trying to cause. The fifth principle to look at is SRA, so stimulus recovery adaptation. I've done a full video on this in great detail. I checked that out, but how I briefly discuss how this applies to hypertrophy and size. Number one is your size and strength. So the SRA curve is the stimulus training. You get fatigue, and then you recover to baseline, and then you adapt. And if you're bigger and stronger, those curves tend to take longer, so your training frequency will be a little bit less than a smaller, weaker person. They'll be able to train a muscle group more often than you. Then it can be muscle specific, so that the fibre type of the muscle, its size, its architecture, its force production, the amount of damage it takes on when you train. For example, exercises that get a lot of stretch into a muscle tend to cause quite a lot of damage and maybe recover slower. So think of like an RDL causes a lot of stretch on the hamstring, quite a lot of soreness as a result. Probably can't do RDLs quite as frequently as you could do leg curls. So as a rule of thumb, smaller muscle groups tend to be able to train more frequently than bigger muscle groups. The sixth principle to look at is phase potentiation. So if we just refer back to like that powerlifting example to talk about how that works, they might go from a hypertrophy block to a strength block to a peaking block. So you get bigger and then you use that size to get stronger, and then you have a phase where you taper down your training volume to showcase your performance and peak in competition. So how you sequence your training for size gains is also relevant. So you might do a strength phase first up to get stronger, allow you to lift more weights at higher rep ranges. Then you might go into a medium volume approach, and then the next phase you might decide to overload on overload on volume to cause hypertrophy. So the next phase is a really high volume phase. Then after that you might transition to a maintenance strength type phase and then repeat the process over. But phase potentiation is how one phase leads on and potentiates an improved performance in the next, and it leads logically onwards. So you want to set the phases up so that what you've gained in one improves what comes next and builds on it. Then finally, the final principle is individual differences. And this is a smaller, less important one than specificity, but if you're really trying to get the most from your training, it's worth noting. So looking at your psychological profile, what motivates you, what sort of exercises do you enjoy, what approach to training do you enjoy? These are all factors. If someone could write in theory, the most perfect program for you, but if you hate it and are not motivated by it, it's not going to get you results because you're not going to work hard on it. I've seen Christian Thibodeau talk a little bit about people's neurological profile and how you should adapt their nutrition and their training for that. Really interesting to me. I don't know a whole lot about it yet, but I'm keen to learn more. But yeah, it's definitely a factor to consider. Lifestyle factors is one. If you're a high-achieving professional with a really stressful job, a family, a long commute, tons of demands on your time, your training is going to be different to a guy who's a student who only has to attend 6 hours of lectures a week and just please himself the rest of the time. Naturally, your training sessions aren't going to be exactly the same, and the amount of training sessions you can do not the same. So you need to consider that. Responsiveness to training is another thing to consider. Some people, they just have to look at a weight and grow. Well, if that's you, you're probably not even looking at this video, because why would you? You're just growing for with little effort. Scumbag, hate you. But most of us, we have to work a bit harder than that, and some of us have to work a whole lot harder, have to really think outside the box and tick all the little details, tick those boxes to make sure they give themselves a chance to grow. I mean, one of the reasons I'm so interested in all this stuff is I've never found it easy to build muscle, so I have to really go in depth and try and dot all the I's and cross all the T's to put everything in place to give me a chance to do it. So your responsiveness to training is a factor. Then maybe you consider, do you have a lagging body part, strong or weak body parts, how you set up your training. If you've been doing this a while, you might find that certain muscle groups have grown really well while others haven't really responded, and then what strategy are you going to put in place to balance that out and create a nice symmetrical physique. Maybe training it more frequently, or looking at the way you perform certain exercises to target those muscles. That becomes a factor as you become more advanced. Another thing we talked earlier on in fatigue management and how you overload is that you should push towards your maximal recoverable volume. Well, everyone's different. Yours will change based on what's going on in your life, but just your base MRV fluctuates up and down a little bit, but that range probably doesn't change that much. Whereas another guy, his might be way up here the whole time. So if he trains at the same training volume as you, he's under training the whole time. There might be a third person who's way down here, and if they try and train with your volume, overtraining. If they try and train at this guy, it'll practically kill them. So you've got to be aware of that. How much training can you do and recover from and thrive on to progress? It's one of the reasons why, like a good example I think of this is if you have a training buddy, you don't use exactly the same weight on all the sets because you can't do it. You're not as strong on certain lifts and you can't do as many reps. But why should you then just blindly follow exactly the same program with the same sort of sets and reps with only weight adjusted for you? You might not be able to recover from so much, or because you can't lift as much weight, you may actually be able to do more overall sets. You should tailor this to you. Anyway, that gives you an overview of sort of how I believe the scientific principles of training apply to hypertrophy and getting bigger and basically getting jacked. Just to recap, you want to focus on specificity, overload, fatigue management, variation, stimulus recovery adaptation curves, the phase potentiation, and individual differences, and in that order. So specificity is key. Make sure you're training towards your goal. If you're not doing that, everything else is worthless. All right, guys, I hope that helped. Hope that helps you to build a training plan and approach that suits you that little bit better. And if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up, comments below, drop me an email, whatever. I'll be happy to hear from you. Catch you later.